How's the younger part of our
Ready
team?
when you are.
Okay, we're on.
Good morning. I'd like to call the work session to order. Let's start the work session by saying the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, announcements this morning. I think Ms. Tusing, we said that the time would be limited to 9:45. Is that correct? So as we approach 9:45, if we haven't already completed discussion, we'll go ahead and call the work session to a recess. All right. I think it says on the agenda citizen comment. So is there anybody in the audience who wishes to come forward and speak on anything other? We're going to have another citizen comment at the public hearing for the regular agenda, but is there anybody who wishes to come forward and speak on anything today? Okay, seeing nobody come forward, we're going to move ahead to the presentation. So, Ms. Barrett, good morning.
Good morning. Today we are here before you with this work session to talk about our next round of Land Development Code changes. Back in May, the Planning Commission approved transmittal to the Board of County Commissioners of our comprehensive plan amendments that we're calling process improvements. The board hearing was held on June 7th for transmittal of those amendments to the state, and we have since received the state comments back on the plan amendments, and they basically really had no issues with the plan amendments, and actually FDOT was very supportive of the amendments, and all of those comments will be included in the packet for the adoption hearing in front of the board on 8/23. So we're moving along as planned with our schedule. The plan amendments hopefully will be adopted on August 23rd, and then we'll follow through with the Land Development Code amendments, which is scheduled for September with the Planning Commission. So today we just wanted to get, again, the issues that we are presenting to you and to the public through this televised work session and before we go to you in September. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pat.
Very good, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Pat Tajewski. I'm a planner with SNME in Orlando. And I'm going to take you through a PowerPoint. And it may seem a little bit repetitive because we just did that with the comprehensive plan, but the idea is now to implement what was adopted or what will be adopted with the comprehensive plan. So we're going to talk a little bit about the background again. We're going to talk about special approval and plan development, which are two types of development review processes that we're looking into. And then the types of activities that those processes affect, which include affordable housing, clustering, and activity nodes. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between the future land use map and your zoning map. In terms of the background, what Lisa said, we've gone through several phases, amending the comprehensive plan, amending the land development code, started with the urban core of the county. Now we're looking at countywide. And we're looking specifically at some major issues, major items, one of them affordable housing, activity nodes, and clustering, like I mentioned before. So let's talk about special approval. If you recall, when we went through the process of amending the plan, we talked about this table that we have in the Land Development Code that lists all the different activities that would take you through a special approval process. We decided that we're going to get rid of that special approval process, but we needed to look at what the alternatives were. In some cases, it was a matter of just deleting the requirement to go through that process. In other cases, it was sending it through a different type of approval process. In other cases, it was a matter of just adopting new regulations. So that's where we are now. We're talking about how we're going to do that. So that table, 3.4, is going to just go away. The summary of the items that we found in that table that needed to be addressed, there were some items, like for example, mixing land uses. In the past, if you were going to mix two different types of uses, you needed to go through a very tedious process to get those approved, and in the end, you didn't know if they were going to be approved or not. And this is something that we want in the county. To be sustainable, we need to allow a mix of uses. So the solution to that is that we're going through the Land Development Code, saying that mixed use is allowed, it's encouraged if you're in the right place, and then we're going to have standards. We had to go back to even saying things like, how do you measure density and intensity? Things that would support mixed uses in the future. The comp plan used to say that if you exceeded a certain density or intensity that was still within the umbrella of your future land use category, that you had to go through this special approval process. Well, what we're doing now is saying if your future land use category says a maximum of 6, we want to have adequate zoning districts that would allow you to get there. It does not mean that if you have residential 6, you're by right going to be able to do 6. It all depends on where you are. And the way to do that, to know that, is when you go through the rezoning process. So if you're in residential 6, but you have Ag today, you can request a rezoning, but it's not guaranteed that you're going to go up to residential single-family 6. Another issue was development size above a certain level. And this is something that was tied to the commercial locational criteria, which allows commercial in the residential areas up to certain limits. So we're transferring all that information into zoning, so we can use your zoning districts to continue allowing that. Now we have the overlay districts, so the watershed districts, coastal districts, and the Florida International Gateway District. We have regulations in place. We have improved them, and then what we're gonna do is in the future just enforce those regulations. And if there are issues that need changes, deviations because of overriding public interest, we're gonna send those to the board. But other than that, it's gonna be just meet the code and you're fine. Then we talk about the 25-year floodplain. Same thing. We went through the code. In the old days, when they asked for special approval if you were in that area, it was because there were no regulations in place. Today, between the Water Management District and the regulations that we have in place, we feel that it is okay to just meet the code. Same thing if you're adjacent to perennial lakes and streams. We have worked with staff very closely, trying to update those sections to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks, that everybody's going to meet the setbacks and the buffers that are required. In terms of affordable housing, it's something that we want to facilitate in the county. We need to meet that need, but we had so many obstacles in the past that we needed to fix that. So we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that later, but we want to work with that density bonus system that we have in place and make it better. And in terms of clustering, same thing. When you have sites that have a lot of wetlands or differences in elevation, wooded areas, you want those people to cluster their developments, but we were making it difficult. So the idea is that with regulations in place, it's going to be easier and we won't have the need for a special approval. We have some future land use categories that are unique, like the attraction or mixed use or mixed use community. In the past, we have required special approval and plan development. We are going to still rely a little bit on the plan development for those, but the special approval was just duplication of efforts. There was something having to do with mixing or expanding illegally existing industrial use, and it was like making it a big deal in the comprehensive plan about that. We have standards that address nonconformity, so there was no need for that one. Issues with the central sewer system. It was a little bit convoluted in the code, so we went in and cleaned it up, created a system so that there's no need to always go through special approval. And then most of the issues related to compatibility were sent through this process. And we have setback regulations, we have buffer regulations, so we're saying let's just enforce the code and that should take care of it. Plan development was very similar. We were requiring a lot of projects to go through plan development when it wasn't really necessary in all cases. So if you have a specialized purpose type of use, sure, go through plan development. We agree with that. If the developer is looking for flexibility, that's what plan developments are there for. Like I mentioned before, mix of uses, not necessarily. You don't have to do PD. You could if you want to, but you don't have to be. taken through that process. If you're going to use higher densities and intensities, the same thing. Preservation of natural features, no, just meet the code. You don't need to go through a PD to waive those. If you have a project where the county needs to include some stipulations, maybe that's a good way to do it because of the developer agreement that goes with it. And then if you're going to have innovative use of bufferings or mitigation, that's something, again, that you could do a PD for that purpose. So the idea is to prevent what has been happening in the county where almost half of the land has a PD designation. The idea is to still allow the PDs as a voluntary process, but allow people to do more with just the zoning code and the zoning districts. And this is, again, very similar to special approval. It seems like anything that went special approval would also go PD. So certain land use categories, development compatibility, density, intensity, affordable housing, clustering, and even requiring a 3,500 square foot building to go through a process like PD, which is very time-consuming and expensive. Okay, so let's talk about affordable housing. So if you look at the comprehensive plan, in several places it says we have to encourage affordable housing. We have to make sure we meet that need in the county. So the system that we have in place today, it allows for higher densities, but it requires that the developers go through a certain process that makes it more expensive. And at the same time, the way the system was set up, it talked about the next higher future land use category, and it was difficult to know when you reach, residential, 16, where do I go from there? Is there another, what is the next one in that case? So we're proposing a system that specifically states the density that you could achieve if you can get a bonus approved. And instead of making those PDs, we're recommending that you use your zoning districts. But then when you go through that process, so you would go to the Planning Commission, you go to the board, you request your rezoning, and then if it is approved, we would add an H to the nomenclature, because if that project ever goes away, that bonus goes away too. It's not like somebody else is going to buy the site and utilize that density. So we want to make sure that those rezonings are tied to a development that is affordable housing.
Pardon me,
Sure.
Is this this is proposed, correct?
This is proposed, yes.
Thank you.
Something else that I want to mention here. So when we talk about zoning, we talk about the minimum lot sizes, and we're thinking that for affordable housing, one of the bonus or incentives would be that you can go a little bit smaller than what you would normally do in a regular zoning district. Now, I mentioned that they would have to rezone. So, yes, I mean, it's not like somebody's going to come in, find a site, and boom, it's going to have, twice as much density as the site next door. I don't think neighbors would like that. So there is going to be an opportunity for public input where, let's say they have agriculture today, but according to their future land use category, they could go up to residential 6 to do more units. They're going to go through a rezoning process. And the process says that you have to meet certain criteria. So we talk about compatibility with existing development, availability of public facilities, consistency with the development patterns in the area. It's the logical expansion of the existing zoning districts. Are there any environmental impacts? And are the types of uses allowed consistent with the area? So again, it's going to be reviewed by the county, but it's not going to be the same process as the PD, which is longer and more expensive. In terms of clustering, so the comprehensive plan. Sorry.
One question,
Sure.
just going back to affordable housing for a second.
Sure.
Is there, when we're talking affordable housing and you look at the bonus sheet that you just showed us, do we define what % of the development should be affordable in order to kick into the bonus category?
Yes, and we're not changing that. That's the same that we had before, which I believe is 25%. And
remains
it
the same.
defines what affordable is, and there is an agreement that you have to sign saying that you're going to keep them affordable for so many years.
Okay, thank you.
Pat, next slide. With regard to compatibility, is there anything that requires or speaks to the compatibility of affordable housing to another type of housing?
We have we'll talk a little bit about that later, but we have a new section in the Land Development Code that we're proposing that is called development compatibility. And basically, it's similar to what we had adopted for urban corridors before.
Right.
And it's being sensitive to the single-family zone property next to your site. So there may be requirements for lot size compatibility at the edge of the development, but not necessarily in the center of the development.
Okay, so we'll have something that clearly defines some of the elements of compatibility with regard to similar uses?
Yeah, that's the idea. Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
And then for clustering, we have the comprehensive plan again encourages clustering. So we needed to come up with standards for that so that people would know how to do it, and it wouldn't have to just be a situation where you go to the board and propose whatever you want, and the board wouldn't have criteria to approve by. So what we're doing is coming up with provisions that address location, density, the size of the development, minimum lot sizes, setbacks, and again, compatibility. In terms of the lot size, this is another opportunity that we thought, should we consider the smaller lots than allowed by zoning? And that's something that, at this point, the drafts don't show that, because when you do clustering, it's different than when you do affordable housing. The idea is not to, make them affordable, it's just to protect the open space. But it is something that, as we go through the process, people may come and say, well, if we're going to allow 4,000 square feet in clustering, should we go down a little bit more than that? Now, activity nodes. So for many, many years, you have had something in the comprehensive plan that is called the commercial locational criteria. And it says that if you have nodes in the county, like intersections of arterials and collectors, you may be able to do some commercial development. The idea is that all residents should have some type of commercial nearby so they can meet their commercial needs. There is a chapter in your comprehensive plan, it's within the future land use element, that talks about how that's done. So it's not like you have an intersection and then you start growing out of that intersection. No, there is a limit. There is a distance as to how far you can go from that intersection. The comprehensive plan also talks about, should it be a small type of development, a medium size, or a large size, depending on your future land use category. So we're picking up on that and just trying to implement it through zoning. So instead of calling it commercial locational criteria, which implies that you're only going to have commercial at those nodes, we want to call them activity nodes. That means that if you're going to put a mini town center at this intersection, maybe you can have residential above. So you do a mix of uses, and it would be a little bit more sustainable and at the same time help with the provision of affordable housing. And in this case, I talk about affordable not as tight as the definition is, but more like for younger professionals who can't really afford the homes in the subdivisions. Yes.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Thanks. So, for example, where new zoning and new urban planning says we want to have residents that can walk to services like groceries, gas, hamburgers, all essentials. That's kind of this concept, right? So we look at the node and we say it supports this, it makes sense there, it's consistent with the surroundings. It's not just you can only have this much density, this many units. It's a more analytical review of it as opposed to a structured?
We do have some structure to it in terms of lot sizes, density, intensity. We do because it depends on if you're in a, let's say, a residential 1 or residential 3 area. That means large lots, very suburban type looking. If you're going to put a node, you can't put a very dense node next to those homes. So it's related to how dense the area already is in the future land use map. So I'll explain a little bit more about this as we go through it. So when I was mentioning that the comprehensive plan talks about the small, medium, and large, so based on that definition, we identified which zoning districts could be compatible with that small, medium, and large. So in the Land Development Code, you're going to have a table that shows if I have the right place for an activity node, what can I rezone to based on what I want to do? So these photos show a little bit of what that means. If you're in a small commercial node, it's more like your little Starbucks, laundry, CVS, getting a little bit larger, your gas station. When you go to medium commercial, that's when you probably start seeing more of the mix of uses, where you can have office developments or smaller shopping centers. And when we talk about large commercial, now we're talking about like the Lakewood Ranch Town Center, the mall, the very large type of commercial development. And the idea is that we want to allow the inclusion of some residential within those nodes. So in the past, you could do that, but you would have to go through plan development. Now we're saying let's use the zoning so that people can do it with the traditional zoning. Now, just like we mentioned with affordable housing, if you're going to do an activity node, you still have to go through rezoning because, again, if you have an agriculture site at the intersection of two arterials, we're not going to let you do commercial in agriculture. So you still have to rezone to one of these districts that we listed, that we mentioned. And then when you go through that process, again, you come to the Planning Commission, you go to the board, you go, I have the right intersection, my development is going to serve these neighborhoods around, and these are the setbacks and the buffers that I'm going to put so that I don't bother people next door. But again, it's a process to make sure that that site is going to be adequate. Now, the difference here between going PD versus zoning is that when you go PD, and I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of here, but when you go PD, you have to have a specific development plan. It doesn't have to be very precise site plan, but you still have to know what you're going to do there, and in general, where the parking is going to be, where the stormwater is going to be, so you have to do a little bit of design for that. When you do a straight rezoning, all you submit with your application is a survey of the site, saying these are my boundaries. And I promise that I'm going to meet all the standards of that zoning district, which we already know what they are. If it is a neighborhood commercial medium, we know what the setbacks are. We know how big that building can get. We know how high the building is going to be. So it's not like you can do whatever you want there. It's already stated in the code the types of uses you're going to have there. And the benefit is that if, let's say, a CVS comes in and they say, okay, we're going to put the CVS here, the CVS goes out of business the following year, it doesn't mean that the owner of the site now has to come back and say, okay, now I'm going to have to demolish that building, I'm going to have to build a different development and go through the whole process again. The way we're proposing, if you're using a regular zoning district, well, it's not a CVS tomorrow, then it's going to be, a different type of use. Just look at the table of uses and it will tell you which uses are possible for that site. So there's not as much accuracy as to on what you're going to see on that site forever and ever. It's a little bit more flexible, but you have the book where you can see how it could change or the potential that it would have for the future. And this is why I was getting a little bit ahead. So I picked a site. I just looked at it and an aerial, and I noticed that there were two arterials. And I said, here's a vacant lot. There is residential to the southwest. I looked at the future land use map, and that area right now has a residential 6 land use category. So it's like, okay, so I could do a medium-sized commercial in that area. I looked at my zoning, but my zoning is RSF 3. Now, based on the table that I showed you before, I could request a higher zoning district, maybe a neighborhood commercial small or medium, or maybe a professional residential small or medium, and that way I could do some commercial on that site. So the current way, PD, there is public review, no guarantee that what you want is going to be approved. There may be an expiration date. Sometimes the board may assign an expiration date for a planned development. If you're going to change your layout, if you're going to change your design, you may have to go through a public hearing process again. If you do it with the zoning, these are the zoning districts you can request. Once it's approved, if it is approved, then they get that zoning classification and they can change design anytime they want, as long as they meet code. No expiration date, because when you rezone a property, there's no expiration date. And there's still public input when you go through the rezoning process.
Pat,
Yes.
for instance, if somebody were to choose one of the listed zoning categories or zoning districts, and for whatever reason they decided that they would prefer maybe a residential RSF 3, if maybe the commercial didn't seem viable and they wanted to do residential instead, they would have to go back through the zoning process to change the district, correct? There's
Yes.
nothing that allows a change in districts.
No, anytime
to
you're going
a
to change
lesser
the zone, you
extent,
have to go through the process.
Even
yeah.
the down zoning.
Yes,
less intense.
yes. I mean, it's easier, the process, in the sense that, it may be easier to get it approved, but you still have to go through a process, because there's an ordinance involved, so.
What is the advantage on that proposal that we have no expiration date stated?
Whenever you rezone a piece of property in the county, and that's, everywhere in Florida, once you rezone, that's what you get. And it's not like when you have expiration dates for planned developments, for example, the idea is that, well, we approved it today based on these conditions, but it may change in a few years. Let's put an expiration date in there, in the ordinance, just in case. Or when you do like a special permit use, or when you do a final site plan, the idea is that because regulations change, we may not want to approve this forever and ever. Now, when you have a zoning district, let's say that regulations change, well, the regulations change. It doesn't mean that you get to use the regulations that you had when you rezone your property. So if 5 years from now, we decide to change the setbacks in the neighborhood commercial, well, that applies to that person too.
One question. I believe one of the reasons that some of the approvals expire is reservation of concurrency, reservation of services. Typically, those aren't reserved through a zoning process, but I think there's an option for that to be done. Is that, I don't know that it is right now. Maybe, I think we have had some school concurrency constraints recently, but I believe the new schools have really, provided relief for those. Is there an opportunity through just a straight zoning to reserve capacity or service for a site?
I would leave that up to Lisa to answer.
Mr. Chairman, I could answer that, I believe.
ma'am.
No. No, I mean, you need a site plan to show where the access points are for staff to run the traffic numbers.
Well, traffic,
And I'm
water,
assuming
sewer.
without any site plan, the staff couldn't do that. They can answer themselves, but generally, no.
So you'd have to go through a PD process if you had any intent to reserve
No, you
capacity.
do a final site plan, Margaret, correct? You do a
What-
final site plan later on.
Isn't there an opportunity to seek concurrency, to submit a concurrency application with the PD?
Good morning. For the record, Clark Davis, Transportation Planning Division Manager. My group is responsible for maintaining the concurrency records for the county. You can make an application for a certificate of level of service compliance as early as general development plan if you meet large project criteria. Otherwise, it is at preliminary site plan or later. So a straight zoning to date has not been eligible for concurrency findings for any of the facility types.
Right, but if you did do say a PSP with a PD, you would have the opportunity to do that, and is any of that changing? I guess it's,
To my knowledge, it is not.
I mean, you could still submit a concurrent application for rezoning and a development plan and reserve concurrency. What we're saying is like they're not automatically tied together.
okay, thank you.
So some people rezone because maybe a year later they're going to build. Other people rezone because tomorrow they want to start building.
Right.
So they're not necessarily tied, but you can reserve concurrency as soon as you have your development plan designed and ready to go.
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Rutledge.
So, kind of going back to kind of the big picture. So is it your assertion with these designs that investors, developers, landowners have more certainty and a more clear path to finish, and so it's good?
It has more flexibility in many different aspects. When you do a PD, you're tied to whatever the board approved. When you do a rezoning, your zoning district allows many different types of uses. It has setbacks, it has height, it has all the parameters for you to design based on that. If you have a piece of property and you want to do commercial and you know you can do it either PD or through the zoning district, which one would be easier?
That's why I'm asking you.
The regular zoning.
Well, if I may insert, Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
it
ma'am.
depends on what your expectations are. If you're ready to go and you want certainty, you want to sell the property, you might want to do PD and get your site plan, everything approved, and concurrency all at once. You've got consultants lined up and just go. It just depends what your plans are.
Right.
It's a business decision for the applicant, really. We're not changing plan development process.
Right.
If you an applicant wants to go that way, they can still go that way.
I would characterize it as brackets of effort. We're not moving the upper bracket, which is the PD process. We're moving the lower bracket to
Yeah, it's an
the
option.
minimum that would be required
It's an
to
option.
get a zoning.
Yeah, if somebody can't live with the setbacks and the FAR, and, oh no, FAR no, but the setbacks and the height, they could still go PD. So PD basically is when you have a design, when you know what you want to do with your property, and zoning is a little bit more open.
You'll forgive me for just being so non-governmental about all this, but my point really is this. People with land want to exercise it. People who want to build tenant buildings or they want certainty and clarity and understanding. And so my question is, do you think that adds to that? Because that's kind of critical to all this. Just changing the rules to have more rules in its space isn't beneficial, in my humble opinion. So
Yeah,
my
but
question
no,
is,
we're not changing the rules. The rules today say everybody has to go PD, for that. Everybody's going to go through the same process, which some people love and some people hate. So we're saying we're going to provide now two options. You can still go that way, go PD, if you're used to hiring the lawyers and the engineers and everybody to do a, expensive type of review. Now you have the option of just coming in, asking for a rezoning, just get a survey of the site. You don't have to design it, you don't have to engineer it, and then you get the rezoning. Once you have that rezoning, then a year later, whenever you're ready, you can hire somebody to design your site, and you say these are the standards, setback of 15, and height of 2 stories, and you design it, and it doesn't have to go back to the board. In that case, it goes through staff.
so I think you're flying at 35,000 feet, and I'm trying to get 50,000 feet, but if we're at 35, we'll say 35.
But, PD is still there.
may,
I'm not taking.
Talking about mechanics, I'm trying to get an overall sense of why we go through the exercise. And
Well,
Ms.
let
Pearson.
me try to give examples of what happens in Manatee County today. We recently did a site plan it had commercial uses, restaurant, and a theater. Zone plan development commercial. The developer found out that they couldn't finance the theater, so they wanted to change and maybe do hotels and things like that. But we were very specific in our plan development zoning district. We did square footage, types of uses, so you will be seeing it again as a revision. They have to come back in because they want to do hotel uses and some still commercial restaurant types of things. So you would have to come back. If that property were zoned general commercial, a theater would be allowed, the movie theater would be allowed, the hotel would be allowed. All of those things would happen without having to come back to the board because it gives you a broad range of uses. In most communities, that's what your zoning is the standard Euclidean zoning. Manatee County is kind of like a hybrid because most communities don't have everything zoned plan development. And it will be a learning curve for everyone because I know that there's some level of concern that, general commercial, you're not telling me what use you're doing. You got to look at the chart and you have to see these are the types of uses that general commercial allows either by right or through special permit. So it is a much more open zoning category than plan development.
that's a great example for me. I understand it clearly. And what I would say, since I'm at 50,000 feet today, is that is a very good solution for people trying to get certainty about a piece of property. Mm-hmm. It helps people selling their land, in my opinion. It helps people who are trying to buy land that are trying to exercise something and not get afraid, well, I can't get anything on there other than this drawing, because everybody then has to redo the drawing and bring it back. So thanks for that.
I do want to clarify one little thing, is that in the plan development, there is a section of the code that does allow staff to look at it. Is it an administrative change? You know, are they not changing, you know, to an extent that it needs to come back to the Planning Commission and the board? So sometimes, yes, some minor changes can be made on plan development zoned property.
Thank you. Pat, thank you.
Then talk a little bit about future land use and zoning. So you have your comprehensive plan with your future land use map, and that's supposed to be implemented through your land development code and your zoning map. But in Manatee County's case, they don't really communicate with each other. So one way that we're proposing to fix that is to have a table in your zoning chapter, which will include the list of future land use categories, and then it will say the potential zoning districts. And there is a caveat at the beginning. It does not guarantee that you can get any of those. You still have to go through the process of rezoning. You go through the planning commission, go to the board to make sure that, which is the best zoning district for that land use category.
Can I talk process for a moment?
Sure.
Mr.
So, in this particular case, which we happen to know because we were involved, the current zoning is agricultural. If the gentleman or the people who are involved in wanting to own this piece of property want to do what you say, then they come and apply for a rezone rather than a PD, whatever. And that would be quicker to do because it would set out all of the uses that are available in that zone, which might be what, just CG?
Well,
NCS.
GC would be your, and again, it depends on what your future land use category is, what the appropriate zonings are. And, and I think that what we have to look at from a compatibility standpoint are, perhaps there are uses in general commercial that may not be appropriate if, I think we allow it at the Res 6,
And it's
residential 6.
It's actually the table that is on the screen. So if you're in an agriculture future land use category
And you have
and you
three.
want to do one of those nodes, the only zoning district that is available to you would be the neighborhood commercial small, which limits the size of the development to 3,000 square feet. Because we believe that if you're in an agriculture area, you don't want to have a target.
Okay, let's get a little more specific. So opposite this piece of property, which is now agricultural, on the other side of the street is all residential. On the other side of the street is a major shopping center. Who decides what belongs in that zone?
The board.
Again, what is the future land use category? Because that kind of drives the zoning districts that you can apply for. And then we still have the compatibility analysis that you are supposed to look at when you do a rezoning. And so, because, as Pat just said, because it's a zoning that may be permitted in, I'm going to pick either UF3 or Res 6 because that's the first introduction of general commercial as an option in the zone in the future land use categories. So in UF3, if what you have is surrounded by residential and the use you want to do is considered too intense, general commercial, you may have to go to a smaller, either neighborhood commercial or neighborhood commercial small would
Or
be a more
PUD.
appropriate, or planned development,
Retail thing.
because then you're saying your uses, yes. So those are the kinds of things that you have to look at. Because this table says that there's an opportunity for general commercial, again, you have to meet commercial locational criteria. There's still a lot of processes. Just because it says that, you got to read the asterisks and know that you have to meet commercial locational criteria. If you don't do that, you can't do it. And then there is some analysis that will have to be done, should be done by the applicant. Go through the compatibility analysis that's both in the comprehensive plan and the zoning code. Do that compatibility analysis and then say, okay, we think we could apply for general commercial. And then staff would review that and either agree or maybe offer a different zoning category prior to it getting to the planning commission.
So from my perspective, if I'm a land user or I'm a landowner, it's my opinion, if you have 50% all as PUDs in the county currently, what may happen is half of those may satisfy going through this process. They don't have to go through that exercise, and they can get the beneficial interests of their goals without having to go the PUD process, which is somewhat uncertain.
Yes.
Not inappropriate, but uncertain. And for commercial investors, I think that's a huge opportunity because it clarifies. If I can meet it, I know exactly what it's worth. If I have to go to the PUD, then I have to determine that later. So my answer to myself, with Ms. Tusing's help, of course, is it clearly is a beneficial opportunity for people to exercise things within a set time frame, cost analysis, and process that's probably improved. So I think that's a good answer.
Yeah, I mean, with the straight zoning or the standard zoning, rezoning, of course you haven't done any site plan, so you then have that process, but it's an administrative process, not, And you don't have, if you have an unusual site or whether it's the shape of the site or something where you need more flexibility, standard zoning is not the place for you. You need to go in, because if you want to vary setbacks or you want to do different things that are not in the standard zoning category district, because it lays out specifically what your setbacks will be, what your height will be, and what your uses are. That's the standard zoning. So if you need more, if you can't meet those setbacks, you can't meet the buffer standards, you can't meet, then you need to look at it, right?
But I do think just other counties have this. My experience is that when you have those certainties and you can fit in that slot, the value that you can pay because of time and cost and uncertainties goes up. And I think it's a beneficial, I think for landowners generally, this is a beneficial decision. It may not fit everybody, but there'll be some percentage of people that this is economically beneficial. It simplifies and it will attract people to the county that may not otherwise come here because of the uncertainty.
Are we widening the uses? I mean, right now, if you look at, what is it called, the Metro Code that goes for the whole, if I go to Venice and it says the current use is CHI, it tells you what the uses are. We have that now, don't we?
Yes.
So how does that differ? If it isn't zoned, it's agricultural, I'll have to rezone it to one of those uses that fits in. That's really what we're saying.
If it is agriculture and you're going to rezone, let's say to neighborhood commercial small, then you look at the list and it talks about, yes, convenience stores,
I got it.
gas stations.
Thank you.
So there will be a long list.
Yeah, there's a use table.
Very good.
Okay, so the uses that you see on this table, colored in orange, those are the ones that you would request if you're doing this commercial locational criteria / activity node. Now, the ones that are highlighted in blue are new districts that we're proposing. Remember when I talked about how in some land use categories, you can only go to a certain density? If you're in residential 6, you can only go to 4.5. Anything above that, you would have to go special approval, plan development, all that stuff. We're saying, no, if you're in residential 6, let's make sure that you can rezone or have the potential to rezone up to 6 dwelling units per acre. So we didn't have 149, so we created 149, and we didn't have for multifamily 12 and 16, so we created those two districts. Now the 149, this is like a borderline because we're creating a residential single family 9, and when you do the math, in order to fit 9 units in 1 acre in a site that may have wetlands and you have to still do open space and streets and all that, the math doesn't have to match exactly, but you have to make it feasible. So this is something that we have been going through trying to figure out, okay, what's the right number for that? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And again, you still see on this table that there are certain land use categories that PD is the only option for industrial urban, public, semi-public, attraction, and recreation open space. So in summary, we are amending the Land Development Code to address the elimination of the term special approval and making sure that we address all those instances, minimizing the reliance on the PD rezoning, allowing activity nodes based on that commercial locational criteria system that we already have in place, but instead of going PD, we want to use regular zoning districts. And then we're adjusting some of the current districts and creating new ones to allow higher densities and intensities within activity nodes and also in conjunction with affordable housing. And then, of course, creating that table that I talked about that correlates future land use and zoning. I think the only other slide that we have is the schedule, like Lisa mentioned. So today is the work session, and the plan is that the comp plan amendments, which already went to the state and came back, are going for final adoption on August 23rd. And then the Land Development Code will come back to the Planning Commission for a hearing in September. And if everything goes well, then board hearing for the LDC October 4th, and the second hearing November 1. These are tentative dates for now, but that's the plan. And if you need to go into any more detail with any of the issues that I mentioned, the changes that I mentioned, I'm here to answer any questions you may have.
Good. Are there any questions for Pat? Pat, I had previously brought up something you had mentioned about the calculation, the ability to get a lot in a specific area with the density. You said you were going to address that, but in addition, in reviewing the zoning district information, there was a section that included, I think, a FAR for single family. I had a little bit of a discussion with Lisa, but I don't know that we ever landed on anything.
Yes.
I'm sorry, my computer went to lockout. The intent is not to have a floor area ratio associated with single family. Is that correct?
With any residential.
So the constraints on a single family lot are essentially the setbacks.
And the minimum lot size.
Lot size and setbacks. So
Yes.
we're not saying you have to limit the lot size to 35% impervious coverage or anything. That's not the intent.
There are standards for open space, but the first parameter that you have to keep in mind is, okay, I have my density, so I can do 9 dwelling units per acre. The second parameter that you have is your lot size. How small can my sites be? And then after that, once you have your lot that is created, then you have to consider, setbacks and open space, if you have wetlands or floodplains or, things of that sort. Mm-hmm. But going back to the idea that you have the regulation of density and lot size, this is very common everywhere, you go, but and they don't necessarily have to match. Trying to do the math, if you say 9 dwelling units per acre, what would the lot size be for that? Well, it all depends on whether you have 1 acre, 5 acres, 20 acres, 500 acres, or an infill situation. Let's say you have a block in the core area, and it has large lots, and they have single-family homes in there. And then somebody comes in and says, I'm going to demolish all those houses, and I'm going to replat that block. So I'm not creating new streets. I'm not creating stormwater or any of those other requirements. So I have these blocks, I'm going to get rid of the lines of the lots, and I'm going to plat it with smaller lots. In that case, it's straight math. So it's, let's say it's 1 acre divided by 9, that's, the size of my lots. But as you start getting larger and larger, and then those are the tables that we have on the screen, we did the math trying to see, okay, so then what size would my lot be if I still have to meet 9 dwelling units per acre, but I have to provide streets, and I have to provide open space and the common areas and all that stuff. So we figured out that for a residential single-family 9 to work, the lot size would have to be 3,600 instead of 4,000. Now, a 3,600 square foot lot, it's pretty small considering the type of development in the county. So at this point, the drafts allow you to go to that size if you do affordable housing. Other than that, we're capping it at 4, which means you can only achieve 9 if you're in an urban infill area. But as you get more into a suburban setting, it's going to be more difficult to meet that 9. You may end up with 4,000 square foot lots, and maybe it's an 8 dwelling unit per acre instead of 9.
Right, and that was one of my points, is if the intent is to make the zoning district as broad as possible, you've created a condition where it only applies to one scenario, and that's a scenario where you have a length of lots, which I think a minimum lot width is 40 feet. Is that correct? I
believe so. 40 by 100.
So 40 by 100 would be the lot size, the minimum lot size, and you would have to have it in a location that has an existing right-of-way. Mm-hmm. So your lot, the property, this category only applies to a piece of property that is 100 feet deep, 40 feet wide, and at a minimum, you could get 9 units in 1 acre. So it's the intent is to make it broad, but the reality is it's very narrow.
And then, that is not something that we're just creating now. That's normal. That's common. Because if you look at your other districts, 4.5, 6, 9, you can't make the math match. So you're always going to have one or the other, right. And you have to meet both.
Well, I'm not interested in the process. My question is, what is the intent? If the intent is to provide,
is to allow up to 9 dwelling units per acre, but not to have lots that are smaller than 4,000, unless you do affordable housing, in which case we should allow them to go down to 3,600 square feet.
Mr.
Back to 50,000 feet if we could.
Yes.
If you're trying to get 25%. I'm making these things up, but if you're trying to get 25% out of the PUD process, you're not going to do that. If you give 3,000 feet of commercial, there's only maybe one possibility that that could work. Same thing with multifamily. If you go to multifamily and say you get 9 per acre, nobody can build multifamily at 9 an acre. So just as a point of information on a commercial or a day-to-day conduct, you're not opening that up. You're redesigning the whole thing, but you're not giving anybody much room to get in there, in my humble opinion. So one of the things you might want to consider is you're saying you're opening it up, but you're not going to make it compatible for many people to go in there and make that offer. I think the commercials clearly not that square footage. Everybody's going to be back in a PUD, in my opinion.
But I know we're talking about this conversation is only about the residential.
But you're
9.
missing my point. Come up higher and look for it.
Yeah. Oh, we have up to 16 by right, and then with density bonuses, if you're an activity center, if you have affordable housing, we go to the 30s. So we have increased.
So I'm just saying that I have a different opinion. I think that you are being more constrained. You're trying to open it up so less people have to do a PUD, and it's just my humble opinion, after being 40 years in the development business, that as an engineer you may find that appropriate. I'm telling you on the other side it may not be, and maybe you want to think about it. That's all.
The density levels, you think?
Density levels and your use levels. But anyway, it's fine. If you.
Okay. Oops, am I on?
Yes, you're on.
It's on.
Okay, sorry. I think that, it's difficult to understand how this works because we don't do it in Manatee County. Now, are you necessarily going to rezone 1,500 acres to RSF 4.5? Probably not. You're probably going to do plan development because RSF 4.5 requires you to have 7,000 square foot lots. So maybe you would do RSF 9, which is the 4,000 square foot lot minimum. Those are the lot sizes you see today in all of the developments that we approve, and most of those developments are in UF3, which is a maximum of 3 dwelling units to the acre. They're not at 9 dwelling units to the acre because they have lots of wetlands that they have to provide, that they can't build on. They have retention ponds that they have to provide. So probably 25 to 30% of their property isn't included. But if you take 1,000 acres times 3, you can have 3,000 unit, right? 1,000 times 3?
I get your point.
Yeah. So is this going to be something that you necessarily do on very large pieces of property? No. Is it going to be something that you do on smaller pieces of property, infill developments? I mean, we are seeing, I think y'all have seen, more straight zonings coming in for general commercial, not so much residential. I'm going to do some research because we did have one residential project that came in at RSF 4.5, and I'm going to see how many units did they get. And it was on a golf course, so it was raw land. They did, they had to put roads in, they had to do drainage, they had to do the same things that you do, but much smaller piece of property. So I just want to see what that looks like. I mean, I think that you're going to have these opportunities. We are increasing density. We are increasing floor area ratio in the future land use categories. But you also have to remember, you have to look back to what your future land use category is. We don't have a lot of Res 16 to get 16 dwelling units to the acre or 32 dwelling units to the acre if you are in the urban corridor. So sometimes it might not match up that well. Vast majority of property, especially that's vacant, is UF3. That's 3 dwelling units to the acre. That's all your density is. And your FAR in UF3, I think, is going to 0.35. 0.35 floor area ratio. So, it's just because you have big pieces of property, you see things differently, and we're trying to encourage redevelopment as well, which we would hope would be able to utilize the standard zoning districts and not have to do a site plan.
Pat, you had mentioned open space. So if you had, let's just take a scenario that I've had in other municipalities where you have a 10-acre tract of land that's an infill tract of land, and you're looking at single-family residential. And if you went the straight zoning, just pick a category. If you did 4 units to the acre, is the intent that the open space would be provided in a common area or a portion of the lots?
I believe that the way it's defined, it's common areas.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
And
The way it's defined is common areas, right?
there's a mechanism in the straight zoning that allows for that.
Your landscape buffers.
Landscape buffers and probably stormwater facility. Yeah. Okay.
Can I just say, and I appreciate, I would never argue with Ms. Tusing because I'm silly. Certainly outgunned, and so.
Never argue.
Of course we don't. But I would just say this, and I think it would only be some interesting discussion. I think it would be interesting for you to consider two possibilities, that perhaps you are looking, and perhaps you are, Ms. Tusing, to your statement, looking at a certain group of properties to pull those out of this process and others not to. If that's the case, I understand. But it still would be my statement that those changes, differential between going from 4 to 9, are not going to change a lot of commercial investors' decisions to move forward, nor is 3,000 feet of commercial property. So you're not going to accomplish what I think you're saying you're trying to do, which is expand those. So I would only say that you would maybe go back and look at the densities and the square footages that you proposed and see if they will really move half of the projects out of the PUD. Because if you don't do that, you haven't accomplished your goal. You just made more rules and changed the rules and moved things around. So I would argue if you're trying to accomplish the other, maybe there's a different analysis. That's all.
Yeah, we just went through the process of the comprehensive plan, which it's the document that sets those densities. We cannot go above those. Even, this process that we're going through right now with the Land Development Code, we cannot go above those. So when we were going through the comprehensive plan process, we were thinking, okay, where do we need to increase densities? Where do we need to increase intensities? And we can't really go from 4 to 50. I mean, it is something
it's America.
that
You can do anything you want. It's just
we went from 4 to 40, pretty much, But, it has been a gradual process. I mean, we increased all the densities that we needed to increase in the urban core, where we want most of development to happen, because that's where you have the infrastructure, that's where you have the services. For the periphery areas, we have increased for certain situations. We want the activity nodes, we want the affordable density, but we're not going to say the whole UF3 area, which is most of the east side of the county, all of a sudden is going to go from 3 dwelling units per acre to 50 dwelling units per acre.
I don't think I said that, but that's a good analysis. My point is this. Are you absolutely sure that these are the right allocations to make it the successful plan that you want? That's all I'm asking. If you can say absolutely yes, I have nothing else to say.
That's where we are right now, yes.
Okay, perfect. Good job. Engineers can do that, nobody else, huh? Thanks.
All right. Any additional questions or comments, concerns? And again, I finally got into the site. I think there may be some clarity added, either a footnote or a clarification that the floor area ratio doesn't apply to single family. In the other sections, it's more specific what applies to commercial and what applies to single family. I think that would be helpful. All right. If there's nothing else, we do have one person in the audience signed up to speak on this. We need to take public comment, so I'm going to go ahead and open the workshop up to public comment. I have a speaker card for Kathy Woolley. Good morning. If you could come forward and let us know your thoughts, please.
I'm Kathy Woolley. I'm an East County resident. First, I'd like to congratulate the staff on the nice job. This is a huge project, updating the comprehensive plan and the land development code. Clearly, a lot of thought has been given and a lot of work done to move us forward. I would only encourage the Planning Commission and later the Board of County Commissioners to keep in mind the problems we see in Sarasota right now with their revisions and the disharmony it's caused between the community and the Planning Commission and the Board of Commissioners. It's very important that we be really clear about what we expect. Will this plan solve the problems that Mr. Rutledge foresees, or will it not? Have we put ourselves in a position where we have removed the Planning Commission and the Board of County Commissioners, our elected and appointed officials, and put too heavy a load on the administrative staff? We recently had an issue out at Terra where an administrative staff person very reasonably increased the height of a building by the allowable 10%, and when the next building came along, wanted to increase it another 10%. Well within their rights, but absolutely not compatible with the 36-foot height limit that has been out in that area of the county for 3 or 4 decades. not something the community supported, and no real way for the community to get involved and convey that message because they really weren't, there's not a process piece, particularly in areas where we have 45% seasonal residents, 95% retirees, a way that where the process is hard for those folks. And often when you get notification, it's a very small group of people who are close enough to the project to get notification. We have over 4,000 residents out of Terra. We're a long tenured DRI with lots of issues still today. Florida is not a place where if it looks like this, it's going to stay like this. Nah. New Jersey, Connecticut, Michigan, Ohio, what you see is what you get. It's been there forever. But here it's not. Here that piece of ag land behind you can be houses next week. So I think giving very serious thought at the Planning Commission level and at the Board of County Commissioners, these are major changes you're making, and they don't get made. I think it's been, 10 or 20 years since those plans, the Land Development Code and Comp Plan have been updated. It's not something we fix again right away. So just, I urge you, please read them carefully. You represent us. We trust that you are looking as carefully as you can, that it will be as positive for the county, that all this work is worth what we put into it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, is there anybody else who wishes to come forward and speak on the Land Development Code revisions?
Can I ask a question?
Let's do public comment first. Anyone else? Okay, seeing no one else come forward, we'll close public comment. Mr. Roth.
So we have the land comprehensive plan. And I'm looking at a piece of property that's agricultural next to a shopping center, and on the other side of the street, a residential area. And the comprehensive plan, what's future use of it? Is it commercial? Let's assume the future use is mixed use. That's in the comprehensive plan, so now I can apply for a rezone to make it general commercial. Is that correct?
I don't know if it's general commercial, but
Yeah.
Well, I'm talking specifically, so you have something
Yeah,
to work
I'm
at.
going to pull up the table that shows the potential districts. Okay, so your land use category is mixed use.
Yeah, I'm going to say the future is mixed use.
If it is mixed use, and you have a zoning right now of agriculture,
Yes.
this, I don't know if you can read that list, but you could apply for anything from conservation, RSF 1, 2, 3, 4.5, 6, 9.
How about 12? I want to do
RMF
apartments.
12. Again, this is something that you can request and go through the process. And then at that point, the Planning Commission and the board would look at it and say, okay, yes, we have a shopping center to the north, we have residential to the south. How compatible is it going to be? The code talks about buffers between that use and the one to the south. And the code talks about, if
So
the
it
area
might fit into
is.
the rezone.
So you would request a rezone to RMF 12 if you wanted to do that.
What about if the future use was commercial and I wanted to do residential? Now, when I say future use, I'm saying that's in the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, the residential office, retail office residential is your commercial land use category. Then you have a list of different districts that you could request to.
Okay.
I think one of the things that's helpful is to consider that what we do is establishing rights. So the comprehensive plan establishes the broadest rights on any piece of property, and every time we go through a process, it narrows the rights. With the straight zoning, it is a broader set of rights than if you went through the PD process. The PD is very narrow with regard to the rights that are associated with that piece of property. So I think that's how I think of it. It's funneling it down. So the straight zoning is a broader set of rights that are associated. Not to say that you're at some point going to have to narrow it. You're going to have to decide if you want to build something specific. So it's a different process. So that's kind of my approach and thought of how to view this. Anything else?
I just want to say thanks for the community comment, because two things. One is, I sometimes think, and I think one of our former commissioners said, they felt like we didn't accomplish much here. And yet I feel like it's one of the places you can really get up and pound your fist and wave your finger at me, and I don't really take offense, kind of like being at home. But I do think that that's one of the benefits we can do. We can ask questions. I can be at a different point of information than our specialists. And I do think that you have to always remember changing can be a 50-50 proposition. It can be better or it can be worse. In other words, you can do all this exercise, spend all this money, and if you don't accomplish the goal, which is to not have 50% in a PUD, you haven't accomplished your goal. And if you, much smarter than me, I work in a different realm, maybe some of the people that are like me don't get your plan and it doesn't work. That would be disappointing because you've done a lot of work, and I think it's well thought out. I'm not finding disagreement with that. I'm asking a mechanical question for people who are on the other side of this story, not engineers, not staff. And they come in with all these kind of like, what do you mean? I have to give you a site plan. So I just ask you to open up to the thinking that there are these possibilities that make this more effective. Not that it's right or wrong, because there's none of that. But be cognizant that if you want to let some people in, the door's got to be wide enough to get the elephant through the door. So anyway, I'm not disagreeing with you. I appreciate very much of this. I do think it's well thought out, and I do think it's a great goal for us not to have everybody come in here and go through the most torturous exercise. Hey, buy this piece of land, zone for this, I can put up a building and do that. Love it. And I'm not just asking for more, I'm just asking the question.
Thank you. Mr. Barnott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate all the dialogue that we had this morning. It's very important to understand your thoughts, the community's thoughts. When you look at moving away from plan development, we're not eliminating plan development, as Pat said, but it's the least favorable option in most cases. As you create all these plan development ordinances, and we have hundreds and hundreds of them, those are hundreds of different land development codes, if you will. Because now we have an enforcement issue or an oversight issue that you look at the land development code and you look at your plan development ordinance, and you have to mix the two in how your setback has to be this, it's not a standard setback, and things like this. We understand that those need to be in plan development. I had a experienced planner one time tell me plan development was originally designed for nuclear power plants. Now that may be a little extreme, but what we're trying to do is establish a predictable process where people can go through this process and there's some predictability to it. Most of this is redefining a process. It's not to make it more robust, if you will, to give the farm away, as some people think. And, I appreciate Ms. Woolley's comments very much because they're to a point where some people think that when we go to this and the things that we're doing, we're giving all the discretion, all the authority to the staff. We're not. What we're doing is trying to establish a process complete with the tables and the charts and the uses and the rules and the regulations, and the elected officials and the appointed officials make those decisions that is this a good rezone or not? Is this a good plan development? Is this a good project? Once that is approved, then our time takes over where we look at the rules and regulations that are approved by these two boards and we enforce those. And that makes the process predictable for developers. Where, when we started this thing back in 2008 with the building department, I had our customers, the builders tell me, we would love to play the game. We don't know what the rules are. That's a fair statement. So we're trying to establish a clear, concise set of rules so everybody understands. And, when it takes infill development and economic redevelopment is very important to me personally. You have to have a process that fits, that makes it work. When I look at a commercial project on the corner of Cortez and 41, and it took 7 years to get there, that's a little unreasonable. because you don't understand or appreciate the time value of money. You know, we're going to talk to some people about some urban redevelopment, major urban redevelopment, here very soon, aren't we?
God willing.
And wow, it can change the face of, of Manatee County and our urban core. So much for the better. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And it's very important to have your thoughts, your opinions, and more importantly, the communities. So, Kathy, thank you.
And I agree with Mr. Barnard. One of my highlights of going through this process is I've had in the past people say it's our policy. Well, is it your policy or your rule? Policies are open to interpretation and change without notice. They may be different depending on who's interpreting or who's applying for or applying the policy. So the way I view this process, and I'm very much in favor of it, is removing some of those policy decisions and making them rule decisions. So I support the effort, even though I can say without any reservation that I'm sure people are going to find issues with this as they go through it and try to apply it, but that's just the nature of the process. The staff and the consultants, I'm sure, have tried to think of as many scenarios as possible, but the reality is every piece of property, every application is going to come in with its own set of issues. So, but I think this is a tremendous step in the right direction. So, Mr. Rutledge, I believe.
Yeah, I just want to say, Mr. Arnott, that was very helpful, because I do think when I see this change, I think the opportunity is to make the change as productive as possible. But in fact, maybe, and I would acquiesce to the professionals, of course, but it may be better just to reconfigure it and not try and change it. Because I understand what you're saying. When we got all these changes and it's like, we want to do this and this, and I'm reading it as like, what are we opening ourselves up for? Like, what have we done when we change some of these codes? And so maybe I've gone to the other side of the fence now saying, oh, let's make it more effective. Let's do more things. And so I do think there's two sides to this. I do think this is the right process, and so don't get me wrong. I also work within the community, and I think we try and do things that are good for the community. They're commercially appropriate, and they're good for the community, and people want to come back and invest and live here like I do. So I also can't help but think of some of the experiences we've had where we're trying to take an empty box that was vacant for 3 or 4 years and put something good in there, and that process, we're going to get it done, but it could have been more effective, and we could do more of that. So please just take my comments as something to think about from people that probably don't get to air this out as much, and think about. I think we do a great job. I live out by Lakewood Ranch. I think we've done terrific stuff from the time Mr. Arnott met me. I'm now much grayer, but before then it was a different process and a different world. I wasn't going to say you. I'm just saying. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you. Anything else? Okay. All right. We're going to go ahead and close the work session unless anybody has any bits of information or, okay. Thank you. All right. For clarification, do we have a hard 10 o'clock start on the regular agenda? Okay. We're gonna take a bit of a recess.
Sure. One last comment.
Yes, Mr.
I want to
Ryan.
thank Pat and Lisa, Margaret, and the others, Ryan, that have worked on this. They've worked very hard. And one of the reasons we enjoy and value working with Pat and her organization is because we get that broad aspect overview of not just what's going on here, but what's going on around the country. That's how far-reaching her expertise is. So thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you.
Good job as always,
Lisa,
Pat.
Margaret, thank you. Thank you very much. All right, we're going to convene and be back at 10 o'clock.